Welcome back to Seek Strength and welcome back to Seekistan. Today we're continuing our investigation into drugs that are used in performance enhancing in sport. And yet again we have another doping case in CrossFit. Over to you, Dara, with the news.
Here I am at the sports desk. 14th of September, they've announced that Svetlana Veselova, which to be honest, if there's a name to get popped for drug use, the fifth place finisher from the women's 35 to 39 division at this year's games, has tested positive for Meldonium.
Now, Meldonium is quite an interesting drug used in the performance enhanced world. It is something that was only recently put on the WADA anti-doping list. It was put on the watch list in 2015 and then finally on the banned list in 2016. So if you're currently taking a drug and it goes on the watch list, know that your time is imminent for being popped for that drug. Now, Meldonium is something that is both used in the medical world. It was developed in the 1970s, but more commonly is used in the performance enhanced world. So there's a what are you saying now? What do you want? What do you want?
Nah, the time's over now.
Now, so Meldonium is something that is actually very, very interesting and is very, very widely used. And it was something that was kind of a blind spot for the World Anti-Doping Agency up until a couple of years ago. So its general use is primarily in a cardioprotective effect. So usually in patients who need assistance in the rehabilitation or hopefully prevention of cardiovascular disease. However, its effects are far beyond that in regards to performance enhancing side of things. So it can do a number of different aspects, primarily in the endurance section of performance enhancement. So it can reduce the amount of lactate during exercise. It can increase the metabolism of fatty acids. It can increase the mobilization of glycogen in muscle and can also reduce the oxidative stress after a heavy workout. And if that doesn't sound like a drug you'd want to take when you're training.
All of that sounds great.
Now, the interesting thing on Meldonium, like we talked about before on these kind of biochemical side of things or the analytical chemical side of things when we're looking to test them, is man-made, fully synthesized, active pharmaceutical ingredient drugs like Meldonium are very, very easy to detect within the detection window. This is a very straightforward drug to detect. They commissioned a German university in 2015 to set up a method for this. And they tested 8,320 samples and 822 of those tested positive for Meldonium, about 2.2% of those samples. So it was a very simple, straightforward test as far as anti-doping goes, which of course is not simple, but when in comparison to EPO or growth hormones or peptides, testing for Meldonium is pretty simple. They use LCMS, as we've talked about before, or mass spectrometry, where essentially you prep a sample, apply some energy to that sample, shoot it across a magic detector, and then you get some readouts on your software. And that's kind of the simplest, most kind of sky-high view way of explaining it. And then if you have taken this, you should never have these metabolites in your system. So if you're taking them, it means you will have these metabolites, and if you take it within the window, they can easily detect it. And if you never take Meldonium, you'll never have those metabolites when they test you.
Now, you might be listening to this video and you might be like, Meldonium sounds strangely familiar. And that's because that's what the tennis player Maria Sharapova was caught with. So in a very, very funny interview, a person who works for a Russian pharmaceutical company said the company had basically 300 times their sales in Meldonium following from her being popped. Also, they said all those sales were going to the UK and the US and they weren't for medical use. Yeah, so now they've started calling it Sharapova-ium. That is hilarious.
So the athlete in this case took Sharapova-ium, and the interesting thing about this was this athlete says they're going to sue the CrossFit Games. So what their argument was that they had emergency surgery on June the 20th. They put this in when they were being drug tested. They said that they were taking this. So they ask you in the drug testing form, have you taken any medications or supplements, and to list all of them. And she put this down and provided the certificates from her doctor, then competed at the games, got drug tested, and then they said that, oh, you shouldn't be having this. Her argument was that she told them and they didn't stop her. However, there's a lot of things wrong with that.
Yeah. The other big thing with something like meldonium is it points out a little grey spot or a black area for many people when you think about drugs and drugs people use in the performance enhancing sphere. Is that meldonium was developed in Eastern Europe. It's being used in Eastern Europe and it's approved for use in Eastern Europe and Russia. It's being made there, and it doesn't fall under the kind of general remit of the FDA, so the UK, the US, and Europe. And this is a major aspect of off-label use in sport. So using a drug that's been developed for something else, whether it's a cancer drug, a recovery drug in this case, and people having no real concept that this is ever going to be used for performance enhancement. And I think that is a major area at the moment, is that there are multiple drugs being used by athletes that nobody has any concept they're being used. They're being developed in a pharmaceutical factory. They're being developed by professionals, but they're not really being tested for, because nobody really has them on the list of things that are important to look for.
So the issue with her case is that her assumption was that if you submit and say that you were taking this and it was given to you by a doctor, it must be okay. Now, whether anyone believes her and that's the actual reason she got caught for this, or she thought she'd get away with it, is another story. Can't really comment on that because we don't know the individual. From the outside, it's pretty cut and dry. She didn't get approved to use this. If this was the case, if her argument held true, then everyone could just be like, I needed a fuckload of D-ball and Androlone to recover, and I have a certificate from my doctor, all of which would be very, very easy to get if you're an athlete and have any bit of initiative. So the fact that it's still performance enhancing drugs, you still get the benefits from it that technically your other competitors couldn't get. So in this case, it doesn't really hold up in terms of like ethically it's okay because I needed to recover from it. The problem here is she took a performance enhancing drug. Just because you put it down in the form and said you're taking it doesn't mean then you can get away with taking it. And it raises an interesting question though. And we had a similar thing with Conor McGregor ongoing, is when he basically destroyed his tibia. He was in kind of a roundabout way saying that he took a lot of drugs to recover from that, and that they know people took that, and that raised a bit of issue then of course with the UFC and related bodies. The idea is it unethical to stop athletes recovering from devastating injuries, from surgeries, from sickness, to stop them from taking this drug because it will have performance enhancing effects? And then of course the remit of WADA, its primary purpose when it was set up was to protect athletes. But are you in this grey area here where you could have a better quality of life, maybe a much better and maybe a permanently higher status of recovery from surgeries or injuries if you took these performance enhancing drugs?
Yeah, and that's where the ethical paradox of drug testing in sport comes into it. If an athlete is massively overtrained, and even if they're using something egregious like stanozolol, say, why would stanozolol ever be useful? If somebody's at that point of overtraining where they're about to die on a regular basis, massive amounts of oxidative stress, massive amounts of psychological stress, then maybe in that case stanozolol was a good drug for them.
I actually have a doctor's note for stanozolol. My endogenous levels need to be a certain amount.
Yeah.
So I actually feel
it's all good.
I feel kind of personally attacked here.
Yeah.
So I know the argument people who are vehemently anti-drugs who are making here, that say, okay, you can take those drugs to rehabilitate, but you can't go compete then. But if you think about it like a workman with their tools, an accountant with software, like this is a tool for an athlete to recover from or do their job more correctly or in a better, more efficient fashion. And if you remove these drugs from them, is this a completely different scenario? Because they're professionals trying to do their job. Is it the same thing as taking a hammer away from a carpenter? Is it that style of thing?
In horse racing, there's an operation they do to the nasal cavity of the horse. So a horse might just have a defect, or through some injury they'll have to get this particular operation done. The operation increases their ability to inhale faster, basically, and they're never allowed to race again. So most of those horses just become euthanized if they have to get that operation done.
Fuck, okay.
Which is kind of messed up, Like the horse doesn't ask.
You need that operation done, don't you?
If anyone could hear my voice, they'd know I do it. Yeah.
Yeah, so it's
at the end of the day, 4-year ban.
4-year ban. So she says she's going suing them, or that was a translation from Google Translate. Interesting. It's always interesting the amount of drugs that come up in these kind of stories, and if they were ever developed as anabolic steroids or performance enhancing drugs, or if they are things that are being really looked at for their multiple benefits in a kind of holistic style of things, similar to Brian Johnson. I know a lot of people are kind of weary of him, the new kind of anti-aging guy who's using some different pharmaceutical drugs for their effect on their therapeutic doses. And it's interesting that even though Meldonium, for example, was developed in the 1970s, it's very promising as a metabolic aid and its relation to cardioprotective effects. So it's funny, but fuck what, I suppose at the end of the day, really. That's what's the crux of the
I have
situation.
no time for it. Like,
For Meldonium or what?
no, just drug testing in general. Clean sport for me doesn't do it.
So it'll be interesting. I bet nothing will come of this, though.
No.
But I hope you
Absolutely
found
not.
a little information on Meldonium interesting, because
Yeah.
it's always nice to know about them, I suppose.
Now, speaking of performance enhancing substances that will make your life better, today's video is brought to you by Sika Sleep. Sika Sleep has all of the nutrients, vitamins and minerals you'll need to get the best possible night's sleep, which will allow you to go and train that bit harder tomorrow. If you want to get it, it comes in a box of 30 sachets. You basically empty your sachet into a little glass, 250 ml of water, drink it around an hour before bed, and you will sleep like a baby who's taken Sika Sleep.